This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 1101, recorded on March 29th, 2024. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today from Fort Lee, New Jersey, Dixon Despommier.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Vincent. Welcome back from the Lone Star State where you were ensconced. Glad to see you made it out alive. I hope you didn't make it down to the border. That's all I can say.
No, I didn't do that.
All right, enough of that. I'm looking out the window.
Is that where the Lone Star tick comes from?
It is. Looking out the window, it looks like a great day, but if you go outside, it's windy and it's cold, and it just so happens that it's the opening day of the baseball season at Citi Field. And the Mets, when I left them, were leading 1-0, but that's obviously going to change. And hopefully for the better, but it usually isn't.
Also joining us from Madison, New Jersey, Brianne Barker.
Hi, great to be here. We have the same weather that Dixon mentioned. It looks lovely. It is windy outside. Also cold in my office, but that's okay.
Your smile will warm it up.
We have a guest for you today from the University of Pennsylvania and Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, Paul Offit. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm actually in Naples, Florida right now till tomorrow when I fly back to Philadelphia, which is where I belong. It's be there outside. I'll be in the high 60s. Beautiful.
Nice.
Yeah,
60s.
Naples is a great city. I like it too.
Well, Paul is no stranger to listeners. He's been on TWiV many times, but of course now we do Beyond the Noise, his weekly column. And but today we're going to talk about his latest book. Before we do that, I have a couple of announcements for you. First of all, if you like our work here on TWiV and all our other podcasts, we'd love your support. You can go over to microbe.tv/contribute. We are a nonprofit, so your donations are U.S. federal tax deductible. A couple of meeting announcements. ASV, American Society for Virology. Are you an international scholar and you want to attend ASV 2024 or 25? Do you want information on visitor visas for meetings or permanent resident or other visas? The ASV is hosting a webinar called Navigating the U.S. Immigration System. Oh my gosh, it must be like weeks long. On April 16th, 2024, presented by immigration attorney Brian Getson, an expert in immigration practice and preparing EB-1A, EB-1B, and NIW petitions for scientific researchers throughout the United States. So April 16th, it's free, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern on Zoom, and time for Q&A after. We will have a link in the show notes for this episode to register. You have to register ahead of time, or you can go to ASV homepage and scroll down the latest, and you'll see Navigating the U.S. Immigration System. Okay, so that could be useful for many. Remember, 2 upcoming deadlines. First, there is a workshop, April 8th to 10th, 2024, on classifying viral subspecies. So this is going to be co-hosted by BVBRC, CDC, NCBI, and NIAID to help review existing classification schemes, develop best practices, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll put a link for that to register for it as well. It's April 8th through the 10th. It's a multi-day affair. And then we have options 12 for the control of influenza. That's in Australia, September 29th through October 2nd in Brisbane. We'll put a link for that in the show notes. But the key here is if you want to submit an abstract, it's April 5th. So not a lot of time left. We're going to be doing a TWiV there. So Kathy Spindler and Steph Langle will be going to the meeting. So we'll all do a TWiV. And you can cuddle with cute Australian marsupials right at the meeting.
I saw that bullet point and I was like, that was a key bullet point he better mention.
Hopefully not acquire any zoonotic infections. Right?
Don't mess with the platypus.
Early bird registration ends June 13th. And now I have an announcement that is actually Paul Paul's doing, because Paul put me in touch with a writer called David Margolick. And I talked to him this week, and he said, would you mind asking the TWiV audience if they could help me? So here's what David wrote. He's writing a volume on Jonas Salk for the Jewish Lives series published by Yale University Press. He's looking for anyone in the TWiV community who encountered Salk over the years, whether at medical conferences at the Salk Institute, in connection with his work on polio or HIV, or just informally. If you have impressions, memories, or observations about him, or suggestions on anyone else who might. And he also would welcome thoughts on Albert Sabin, and particularly the Salk-Sabin relationship, which, in case you don't know, was rather contentious. And he said any communications can remain on background if you prefer. So that means you don't get into the article. He can be reached at Margolick, MARGOLICK, at gmail.com. And we'll put that in the show notes as well. But, it's harder and harder to find people who interacted with Salk or Sabin. Did you meet either of them, Paul?
I met Salk. Yeah, we both were speaking at a conference at Pittsburgh, Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. So we were on the same platform. So I met him briefly.
Yeah, I saw him at a meeting once in 1981, but I met Sabin a lot, and Sabin had opinions about Salk. But I've also interviewed one of Salk's sons for TWiV, and also Julie Youngner, who worked with Salk, and who had kind of a falling out after the licensure meeting in Ann Arbor in 1955. They didn't like each other anymore, so... I told David to listen to those interviews, and he really enjoyed them. So anyone who has any information or might know someone, all the people I can think of are no longer with us. Did you ever meet Salk, Dixon?
No. I was in the worm group of the biology meeting.
I understand.
You know what I mean. I met all the Sinusitis elegans people, though.
You met Peyton Rouse.
I did.
That's pretty cool.
I did. I also, as I'd mentioned before, held the original slide of the chicken tumor that was brought to Peyton Rouse from a New Jersey chicken raiser. And that started a whole new way of looking at disease. Yeah, it was cool.
Anyway, thanks. It was very interesting to speak with David. But I have to tell you, he's old school. He takes notes on a typewriter while he's talking to you.
Can you hear tapping it away?
It's so noisy. It's the noisiest typewriter I've ever. Right, Paul? Don't you think?
Right. He's an interesting guy, smart guy.
I said, it's not hard to. We were doing a FaceTime on iPhone. It's really easy to record on an iPhone. He said, "Well, I'll figure it out one day." So that means he's not going to ever do it. But he's done a lot of writing. He used to be at the New York Times and many other good outlets. So he's a very good writer. So it'll be interesting to see. It's interesting that both Salk and Sabin continue to inspire writing, right? There were such interesting characters. Besides making important vaccines, they were interesting characters, right? Salk, he did this, then he went on to become like a cultural hero, and when he married one of Picasso's ex-wives or something like that. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
He founded the Salk Institute, beautiful piece of architecture out in San Diego. And then Sabin, of course, just a very outspoken guy. Anyway, we're going to talk about Paul's recent book, which I have right here, Tell Me When It's Over. It says, the subheading, An Insider's Guide to Deciphering COVID Myths and Navigating Our Post-Pandemic World. And Paul and I talked about this a little bit on Beyond the Noise, but I said, come back on when it's published, and we get you a TWiV bump, and then we can go into it a little more deeply. So I'll start by asking you, Paul, there are a lot of books on COVID. Why did you write another one?
Right. I guess it was cathartic, if nothing else. I was asked by Francis Collins to be part of the so-called NIH Active Group, which stood for Accelerating COVID Technological Innovations and Vaccines. And so that was this public-private partnership starting in April of 2020 to try and advise pharmaceutical companies about how best to test sort of vaccines and antivirals. And then I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. So I had sort of that view of all this. And I think we got a lot right, but I think we got some things wrong, especially regarding communication. And I think, you learn as you go. And there were some things that we didn't know early in the pandemic that we learned later in the pandemic. And trying to convince the public of that you do always learn that as you go, that there is invariably a human price to be paid for medical innovation, I think is challenging. So that was it. It was cathartic. I just needed to do it. Now I feel much better. So,
so when you sort of needed to do it, kind of which audience did you sort of think about, and which kind of direction did you feel like you wanted to head to in talking to that audience?
So I see it for the general audience. I mean, we all were scarred by the last 4 years in different ways. And for me, this was, some people will see that we get things wrong and just completely, reject everything we say from that point forward. Or people have been confused by some of the things that we said. So I just tried to go through what I thought was my honest interpretation of things we did get right and get wrong. Hopefully people will see that as believable, and also sort of where we're going from here. I mean, COVID, although I think you could argue the pandemic's over if you define pandemic as something that changes the way you live, work, or play. But the virus certainly isn't, and it's still going to be with us for a while. So what now? And I think people are pretty confused about what does it mean to be protected at this point. So I at least put my ideas about that. But it was mostly just something I needed to write. I think there were communications errors, and I just wanted to get that out there to make it clear that you don't always get it right every time.
Mm-hmm.
When did you start writing this? Last week?
I wish. Then I would have never. There would be nothing in that book that wouldn't at least be currently wrong. No, I started during the pandemic. I was writing it during the pandemic, so it was cathartic. So, again, I just needed to write.
How early? Do you remember how early you started? Was it like March or April?
So probably started writing it. Started like in 2021. So,
21, okay.
Right. So the vaccine came out in December 2020. So the following year.
Okay.
So during your writing days, when this was still evolving, what were your biggest surprises in terms of the way things actually turned out versus the way you thought they would turn out?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd like to say no one who commented on this pandemic from the beginning always got it right. I mean, everybody got something wrong. I mean,
you mean Tony Fauci got it wrong?
Everybody got it wrong, except for the anti-vaccine activists. They were always right. But
exactly.
But I mean, so right from the beginning. I mean, this was the third pandemic virus, right? SARS-1 in 2002, MERS in 2012. Well, both of which were, and I thought people thought that those two pandemics might have been predictive of this one. Whereas those pandemics, in the case of SARS, I think there were about 8,000 cases and about 800 deaths. In MERS, there was around 2,500 cases, 900 deaths. And those were much more serious diseases. So it was easier to kind of isolate the people who were infected and those who they were exposed to. I think people were surprised just initially about the degree that there was asymptomatic spread. And how devastating this virus was. I mean, I certainly got that wrong. I remember I was on CNN International with Christiane Amanpour, like in March of 2020. So you're now, the first at least reported American death was the end of February of 2020. It might have well been before that, but that was the first reported death. And, she asked me on this CNN International program, how many deaths did I think there would be? So I kind of looked at China, which had a population 5 times our size, and at least that then reported 3,000 deaths, although who knows, because China was somewhat of a black box. And then you had Italy, which was a fifth of our size, and they had reported so many deaths. And I'm thinking, okay, well, taking all that into consideration, how many deaths did I think we'd have? And I thought, it could be like a really bad flu year, 60,000 deaths, 80,000 deaths. So I was only off by 1.1 million deaths. So if you're going to say something wrong, say it on international television.
It's like as of now, I think it's 7 million deaths, right, globally?
Yeah, worldwide. Yeah, but 1.1 U.S. is what we had.
Okay.
Did you end up having to make a lot of changes, or did you have a different process with this book because the information was changing frequently? You mentioned, only because it was not written last week, there might be things that were wrong, or if you had written it last week, maybe that would be the only way. Nothing would be out of date. So did you have to do this differently than other books you've written?
Yes, no, it's constantly updating. And I think, and also, the book isn't published, the day after you're done writing. I mean, there's still 8 months or 9 months or something between between when you think you're finished and when the publisher actually publishes the book. So you're always a little nervous about that. But so far, at least for this moment, I haven't said anything in that book that was patently wrong. So that's good. But give it time.
I wanted to go through some of these chapters. They have great titles. Chapter 2, The Lure of Conspiracy. And this is, of course, on the origins of SARS-CoV-2. And one of the things that you wrote is a huge number of Americans still believe that the virus came from a lab. And why is that? And can we ever fix it?
Well, the short answer to can we ever fix it is no. I think that in terms of why, it's just very seductive. It's a very simple explanation, and simple explanations, I think, are compelling. So instead of trying to go through the details of what it would mean to have an animal to human spillover event, which is what I think did happen in the western section of the Hunan wholesale seafood market, and all the evidence points to that. But that's harder to understand than to say to somebody there's an evildoer. And I think we'd like to think that there's an evildoer, that those who are prone to conspiracy. It's nice to believe there's an evil actor working behind the scenes against us. I mean, whole congressmen will use terms like deep state. So it's very easy. It's very seductive, and it's hard to get past that. And you're right. First of all, 2/3 of the American public still think that this was a lab leak. You have responsible people like Marty Macri from Bloomberg School of Public Health at Hopkins getting up in front of Congress and saying this is a no-brainer. This was a lab leak. Rand Paul continues to push that.
The other famous virologist.
The head of the FBI or the head of the Department of Energy. I mean, all get up and say this was a lab leak without any evidence. If you believe, the extraordinary claim should be backed by extraordinary evidence, which is what Carl Sagan says. This is an extraordinary claim. I mean, it's backed by no evidence. I mean, when have we ever created a pandemic virus in a laboratory? There's been lab leaks, say smallpox, but pandemic virus, it's never happened.
I think you're going to have to go back to the Greek mythology accounting of disease for Pandora's box. And if you do, then that starts there and goes forward. And after that, everything has to come from a box. And a lab looks very much like a big, giant box. And we always call them black boxes. When we don't understand anything, we create mystery around it by saying, well, there's a black box associated with this. And I think that most people don't understand how science is done, nor do they want to know.
Yeah, I agree.
So they take the common knowledge approach. Well, if Pandora says it's from the lab, then it's got to be from the lab.
And I think also China was very slow to let international teams of scientists come in and examine it. That only contributed to that. There's sort of xenophobia. They're trying to deny that it really was their fault in any way. But
exactly. Well, they had some problems with the other one, right? The SARS-1.
Right.
I mean, I was part of a group that went over to China for that. And their entire team of public health, after we left, was fired by the Chinese government and replaced by new people. So there goes the institutional memory. And in all comes these new people supporting the governmental point of view. And it's just maddening to see how politics plays a big role. And then this one, too. And I'm sure you cover that pretty well in your book.
Paul, is there a particular moment during the pandemic when this lab leak nonsense began, as far as you could tell, or is it just
January 2020? There was a large article in Washington Post saying that the credibility of a lab leak theory, and Rand Paul quickly pushed that. He brought Tony Fauci to testify in front of Congress, which got a lot of play. Mm-hmm. No, it was right there, right from the beginning. There was a movie called Plandemic, which was put out by Judy Mikovits and Mickey Willis, again making that claim, and that went viral very early in the pandemic, before there ever was a vaccine, talking sort of March 2020.
They should have made people realize that it was fiction, science fiction.
Yeah, I think people have seen enough examples of crazy things happen in science fiction and haven't seen the examples of what has really happened in science.
But isn't it true, Paul, that when AIDS began in the 80s, there were similar theories? That it was made in the U.S. government lab until we pinpointed the origin, right?
That's right. The CIA was behind it. There was a way we had as a weapon of bioterror that we just tried it experimentally in Haiti, and it got out of control. I mean, that's all. Right. There was a Nobel Prize winner an ecologist who bought into that notion. So this is where the term Nobel Prize disease comes from, that even very smart people can be susceptible to conspiracy.
Absolutely.
Well, the problem is the lab leak idea has bigger ramifications, right? First of all, it ruins relations between China and other countries. And then people in the future, people are going to think that's how these things happen. And as you said, never happened. We never had a pandemic virus starting in a lab. Never.
If people realized what we have worked on in the laboratory, like say at the Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever Laboratory, which is not devoted to that any longer, but if you had a list of the organisms that were allowed in that door and then never got out again, you'd realize how tight the security is for laboratory work.
Well, that's the problem. I think that's absolutely right, Dixon, that people just don't know what goes on in labs.
No, they don't.
Therefore, they assume the worst, right?
They do not.
Right. And I like Paul's point about wanting to have someone to blame or wanting there to be a bad actor. Yeah. It's also hard to think that nature's the thing that's out to get us in terms of evolution.
That's right.
And instead of imagining some bad person.
Yeah, well, Pogo said it right when he said, "We have met the enemy and they is us."
That's right. They're us.
And we get this again and again in various forms.
All right, so chapter 3, a big part of chapter 3 is about hydroxychloroquine and bleach and other things. But tell us why the FDA approved hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, I think that was, if you had to ask me what was the worst moment of this pandemic, it was that. And here's why I say it. So here you have, it's April of 2020. We don't have anything. We don't have antivirals until October. We don't have monoclonals until November. We don't have a vaccine until December for a virus that's clearly killing hundreds of people or even more every day. All we could do was limit human-to-human contact. We wanted something magical to end all this. And there was a group called America's Frontline Doctors. There was a woman named Stella Emanuel who kept pushing this hydroxychloroquine. There was another guy in France named Didier Raoult who sort of also pushed that notion. So the Trump administration bought into that. They bought 29 million doses. They had Alex Azar, who was head of HHS, start pushing for this. And ultimately, Stephen Hahn, who was the commissioner of the FDA, acquiesce to that desire to approve this through emergency use authorization. So what the FDA did was they approved a drug that had not been shown to work to treat this disease, which has side effects like cardiac arrhythmias. And so they approved it. And then what happened is over the next couple of months, study after study after study showed that it didn't treat the disease. And so then what they did in June, roughly 2 months later, 2.5 months later, they withdrew that authorization. That was not a good moment for the FDA, because what that showed you was the FDA could have its arm twisted by the Trump administration. And 10 states immediately formed their own vaccine advisory committees. They did not trust the FDA's vaccine advisory committee, our committee, because they felt that we were malleable by what was the will of the administration. And I know for a fact that Stephen Hahn was pulled into Donald Trump's office before this vaccine was ultimately authorized, and in a invective-laden tirade was told to approve this vaccine before the beginning of November, which was the election. He wanted that vaccine before the election. And in response to that, Hahn, to his credit, immediately did an op-ed piece in the Washington Post saying, "Trust me, we're not going to do that." And then he put that on his website. "Trust me, we're going to have the usual 2-month safety follow-up after dose 2, which puts you into December." And he, to his credit, held to that. But that scared a lot. Remember, Kamala Harris got up, said, "I don't trust the administration with this vaccine." And you could see where that all came from.
How about ivermectin? When did that show its ugly little head?
It was around. So it's all around the same time. We're looking for something magical. Actually, my favorite is the meme that says, just say nay to ivermectin, because ask your large animal veterinarian whether ivermectin is right for you.
That's right.
Oh my God. So Hahn must have learned from his initial mistake, because he was tough the second time, right?
He was, and I'm sure it wasn't easy. Because he was under a lot of pressure to do that. But, the job of the FDA is to stand between pharmaceutical companies and the public to make sure that we are protected from products that are unsafe or ineffective. And the FDA failed there. That was a bad day for the FDA, a bad couple months there. But, then we had the vaccine. But I do think we lost some trust in all that. And not just among, the general public, but among scientists.
So chapter 4 is all about the vaccines and a variety of topics. Let me see here. I forgot the name of. Do you remember the name of chapter 4?
No, I should put the books right up there. Here we go, get it.
I got it right here. Chapter 4 is a ticket out, right? That's the vaccine.
You
It's
can't
a
ask
ticket
an
out.
author the title of certain chapters. It
Oh,
doesn't
really?
work.
I didn't know that.
It doesn't work.
I know the titles of all my textbook chapters. But that's pretty easy. So it's all about vaccine. So I want to talk about what we did wrong in vaccine messaging, because that's a big part of that chapter, Paul.
Right. So I would argue this was, so you have this unusual virus, SARS-CoV-2, which is isolated in sequence in roughly January 2020. So now you can make a vaccine. So we chose a novel technology, messenger RNA, to make those first 2 vaccines with which we'd had no previous experience. And in 11 months, because of Operation Warp Speed, which I think was the single greatest accomplishment of the Trump administration, they bet $11 billion on 6 horses to win 1 race and took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies. In 11 months, you'd done 2 large clinical trials, 40,000 for Pfizer, 30,000 for Moderna, to show that the vaccine was effective and at least as safe as you knew in the trials for tens of thousands of people. That was, I think, the most remarkable medical or scientific accomplishment in my lifetime. It was amazing. And then within 7 months, you were able to inoculate roughly 70% of the U.S. population in a population that didn't have an infrastructure for mass vaccinating adults. And then we hit a wall. Roughly 30% of the U.S. population didn't want to get vaccinated. But I think the first messaging error occurred in July of 2021. So now you're 7 months into the vaccine. There was a group of thousands of men get together in Provincetown, Massachusetts. They want to celebrate the July 4th holiday. Roughly 80% are vaccinated, but there's an outbreak of COVID. So 346 men get COVID, despite being vaccinated. 4 were hospitalized, so hospitalization rate of roughly 1.2%. That's great. That's a vaccine working very well. The remaining 342 had either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infections, which the CDC, in their report of this outbreak, in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, labeled in the title breakthrough infections. The wrong word. Breakthrough implies failure. This wasn't a failure. This was a success. I remember I was on CNN. I remember that you sort of have to wait for like a couple segments before you come on. But I remember they were talking about Brett Kavanaugh, right? Supreme Court Justice. In order to go into the Supreme Court chamber, he had to be tested, even though he had no symptoms, and he was positive. So he had an asymptomatic infection. If you watched the way that was carried on CNN, you would have thought the man was fighting for his life because he had a breakthrough infection. And I think with that, we immediately set a goal for this vaccine that was impossible to reach. This is a short incubation period mucosal infection. You are going to get mild disease again and again and again because for the most part, protection is mediated by neutralizing antibodies in your circulation at the time of exposure, which will fade over time. But in theory, you should be protected against serious disease for a longer period of time because that requires memory cells, which are longer lived. And I just think and so you would have people say, first of all, they're mandating that I get this vaccine. I get the vaccine, and now I have an infection. I've been coughing and sneezing for the last 3 days. I've had fever, joint ache. The CDC lied to me. And so I think we should have very early on set a reasonable expectation for this vaccine. Just a flu, RSV, rotavirus. I mean, those are short incubation period mucosal infections. You're not going to be protected against mild disease for long.
No. An anecdotal story here. I've had all the vaccines upside down, right side up, freebies. I paid for one, and I've had COVID 3 times. And I caught 2 of them at the American Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene meeting because of all the foreign visitors that come over that have not been vaccinated, of course, and they all want to meet you. So they come down and they shake your hand. And so I got one in Seattle and one in Chicago. And the mildness of my infection for the last one was I tested positive, but it was a big surprise. I would have never guessed that based on how I felt. And there's been no repercussions, thank goodness, since then. But long COVID is another possibility that I guess you want to talk about sometime.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the vaccine messaging. I think that when I think about vaccine messaging, I think about all sorts of complex immunology and subtleties of immune system details. And those are clearly not the subtleties that the lay public is aware of. And so I kind of wonder, how do we deal with the subtleties in the details and the fact that the public doesn't know about the difference between infection and disease? How do we do that and do our vaccine messaging to really get this message across when we all know about all of those subtleties?
Yeah, I think very early on, we had to say again and again, and this can come from the CDC. I mean, they're the ones who are doing the recommending. Here's the goal of this vaccine. The goal of this vaccine is to keep you out of the hospital, keep you out of the intensive care unit, and keep you from dying. That is the goal of this vaccine. But given the nature of this virus, it may be that even if you're fully vaccinated, that you may get a mild illness. But this vaccine will keep you out of the hospital. And we really didn't say that early on. And because we were so worried, reasonably, that 30% of the U.S. population simply refused to be vaccinated, and our hospitals were overwhelmed. And in 2021, you were 12 times more likely to be hospitalized or die if you weren't vaccinated than if you were vaccinated. In 2022, it was about 6 times more likely. So I think we overpromised a little bit in the hopes that this would convince people to be vaccinated. Same thing with transmission. I think, you still were going to, you would have a lesser chance of transmitting if you got vaccinated than if you didn't. But it didn't eliminate your chance of transmitting. And I think that, too, needed to be made clear. I think we overpromised a little bit early on, and we lost some trust.
One of the issues with the mRNA vaccines is the recent proclamation by the Florida Surgeon General that there are DNA fragments in them, they're unsafe. So he doesn't recommend them for anybody in Florida. So I don't think that's in the book, but what are your thoughts about that?
It is hard to watch. I mean, he's an MD PhD, Dr. Joseph Ladapo, who's the Florida State Surgeon General, who has a position. I mean, he has a position of authority. He is assumed to be an authority who puts out this notion that there are nanogram levels of DNA fragments. Oh, he doesn't say nanograms, but he says there are DNA fragments in this vaccine. And true, there are DNA fragments in this vaccine, roughly in the nanogram level, meaning billionths of a gram. It's true of anything made from cells. I mean, in this case, you're starting with a double-stranded DNA plasmid, which will have, you will have nanogram levels of DNA in that, as is true with the measles vaccine, or the mumps vaccine, or the rubella vaccine, or the rotavirus vaccine, or the varicella vaccine, or anything where you start with cells. You're still going to have DNA fragments that are there. But again, it's first of all, your cytoplasm doesn't like foreign DNA. I mean, there's a number of innate immunological mechanisms and enzymes to destroy it too. It's hard to get through the nuclear membrane, which is why when you have DNA vaccines, you electroporate, which is to say, do an electrical shock to disrupt that nuclear membrane. Even then, when you're trying to introduce it, 99.5% of that DNA will be extra chromosomal. I mean, it's if you take, for example, oncogenes, which is what he's arguing, that this can cause cancer, that even if you take oncogenes and try and insert them into your DNA or into DNA of an animal, you're talking about the microgram level. So you're really talking about a millionfold more. And you eat, assuming you live on this planet and you eat like anything made from animals or plants, you are ingesting foreign DNA, which will end up in your circulation to some extent. But the minute you say that, the minute you say foreign DNA, people think, it's going to insert itself into my DNA and cause harm. And then, Robert Malone, who was I think a very good researcher. I mean, he certainly did important work in the late 80s on mRNA. He gets up in front of Congress and says the same thing. And goes on to say the CIA is behind all this, just to add to the conspiracy theory element.
Yeah,
and
that's
then
the
DNA actually is a way for the government to tell whether you've been vaccinated.
Actually, in this case, it's the Culinary Institute of America that's behind it.
CIA.
Because it's in all your food.
So Malone is the subject of a chapter on his own, Rogue Scientist. So who is he, and did he invent mRNA vaccines, Paul?
Well, no, but he did important work in the late 80s. He did. I mean, he took mRNA and then either in vitro or in experimental animals showed that you could introduce that mRNA into the cells. It would enter cytoplasm, would be translated, and would make a protein, and argued that mRNA could be used, as he said in his patent, as a drug. That was an interesting first step. I mean, there still were other steps that had to happen in order for there to be an mRNA vaccine, but that was an important first step. Not only that, he's very good at explaining science. I mean, if you listen, not everybody's good at that. He's really very good at translating science for the public. And so he's very, very much believable. And so he's fascinating to me just because I think he did do important work. Both of those studies were published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. Smart guy, but for whatever reason, he sort of just went to the dark side. And I'm not sure I understand why. Maybe it's that Nobel Prize disease thing.
Yeah, maybe he's jealous that he doesn't get any credit, and maybe he's trying to take it out that way, which is really weird because people lose their lives because of that.
Yeah, and one of the discoverers of ivermectin has done the same thing, unfortunately, who was a dear personal friend of mine, Bill Campbell. I don't know why. In his later years, he decided to turn into an anti-vaxxer, but I certainly don't agree with him. And I'm at the age that he was when he first decided to turn and go somewhere else. And that's too bad. It really is sad.
So, Paul, part of Chapter 5, which is all about the misinformation business, let's talk a little bit about anti-vaccine messaging. What gave rise to this anti-vaccine movement? Can you give us a little context on that?
Well, the anti-vaccine movement, if you will, has been around since the first vaccine. The Anti-Vaccination League was born in the early 1800s. If you look at Jenner, as we know, gave what we now know as cowpox to prevent against a related human smallpox. But because at the time in the early 1800s, late 1700s, it was known that he was taking, this pustular material from cows or from people who had milked cows. There were pictures of people, getting these vaccines with fearful looks on their faces as they were developing cow-like characteristics, snouts, floppy ears, tails. And so I would argue some of the arguments for what vaccines can do are about as biologically plausible as that. But thus was the birth of the anti-vaccine sentiment, if you will. So I think there's always been a fear, which is understandable. I mean, you're asking people to inoculate themselves with biological materials that they, for the most part, don't understand very well, to prevent diseases that today they don't see, polio, diphtheria, and that can mean as many as 25 shots in the first few years of life. And so it's understandable. The pushback is understandable. So I do think we need to explain why it's important to do that. But to me, an anti-vaccine activist is someone who is forcefully putting misinformation or disinformation out there that is funded to do it, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with the Children's Health Defense, or Del Bigtree with his Informed Consent Action Network. I mean, those are like professional anti-vaccine activists. The National Vaccine Information Center. These are just misinformation centers, and they're better funded than they have ever been before. I mean, the funding is all on that side. There's much more funding on that side than there is to put out good information, like your information.
Are there things that are particularly different about the anti-vax movement during COVID, either in terms of its funding or tactics, compared to anti-vax sentiment before that?
Yes, it has swung wildly to the right. The notion of personal freedom, bodily autonomy, government off my back, which has always been part of this. I mean, there's always been a pushback against mandates, but never more so than now. And it's been embraced. You'll have Eric Trump at a recent rally saying, look, if you don't want to get a vaccine, know that the Republican Party stands behind you, which is ironic since it was really the Republican administration that gave us this amazing these amazing vaccines, both mRNA vaccines and the original vector virus vaccines. But so yes, it has changed, and it's gotten a lot of money. That message, the medical freedom message, has gotten a lot more money than they ever had before.
So why can't we let people make their own decisions about vaccines?
Well, because it doesn't just affect them. I mean, if you again step on a rusty nail, you go to the doctor and you choose not to get a tetanus vaccine, and you get tetanus, nobody's going to catch tetanus from you. It's not a contagious disease, but measles is contagious. I mean, mumps and rubella and rotavirus, those are contagious diseases, and so is SARS-CoV-2. So if you choose not to get a vaccine, you're not just making a choice for yourself or your children, you're making a choice for those with whom they come in contact, remembering that roughly 9 million people in this country, because they're on pretty significant levels of immune suppressive therapy, can't be vaccinated. They do depend on those around them to protect them. There was one moment actually in California when Richard Penn, who was a state senator, wanted to eliminate the religious exemption. The religious exemption from California, and they didn't have a philosophical exemption, so that meant there would only be medical exemptions. There was a little boy whose name was Rhett Crowett, who stood up in front of that group because this was a very contentious meeting. The anti-vaccine people were there in droves, saying, that you can't eliminate this exemption, this religious exemption. And he stood up and he said, he's 5 years old, so they had to put him on a stool so he could reach the microphone. And he said, I have leukemia. I can't be vaccinated. I depend on you to protect me. Don't I count? He was a really powerful voice, during those meetings.
I remember that.
He was a voice of society.
The thing is, you mentioned something in your ticking off the reason why no one wants a vaccine anymore. And he said, and they would say, and besides, that disease doesn't even exist anymore. And shouldn't you just say, aha? Do you ever wonder why it doesn't exist anymore? I mean, that will catch them dead in their tracks and say, use your head for God's sakes rather than your...
Well, Dixon, then if they say, come back to you and say, well, it's gone because of the vaccine, so why do we need the vaccine anymore?
No. You need to continue vigilance. Look at the measles epidemic that we have right now.
Sure.
As a good example.
Yeah, being
and go to a place. I wish we could take them to a place where people wish they had a vaccine and don't. Sure. And then look at their health status and say, you want our country to return to a time when Mother Nature was calling the shots, no pun intended, instead of the vaccinologist calling the shots, in this case, shots. And the answer would be no, of course not. I don't want to go near that place. Or do you ever get people telling you that I don't want the vaccine, but I got my kids vaccinated, for course sakes. They make an exception for themselves, but not. I have encountered people like that. I think that's crazy.
Sure. Vaccines are a victim of their own success at some level. I think we don't see those diseases. I'll give you another sort of story. When we left Afghanistan, when the military left Afghanistan, there were a number of immigrants that came into this country from Afghanistan. There was actually very near Children's Hospital Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, there was a camp actually for Afghan immigrants. And so some of those children had problems and they came into our hospital. And I remember I was rounding with two of the chief residents and I said, polio still circulates in Afghanistan. Do you think it would be reasonable to test these children when they come in to see if they're asymptomatically shedding polio virus? And they just went white as a sheet. I mean, polio? What was I talking about? The notion that polio was here, was just completely foreign to them. But it tells you how insulated we are from all this at this point. And there was a case of polio, right, in 2022.
Or smallpox. That's right.
So, Paul, chapter 7 is called Pandemic of the Unvaccinated. And so still people don't want to be vaccinated. What can we do to convince them in the light of all this anti-vaccine rhetoric?
See, I think the most amazing aspect of this pandemic to me was the level of denialism. I mean, that there would be people who could say, I just don't think this virus is a big deal. When 2,000 people were dying a day or 3,000 people are dying a day, it showed how facile people were at denying what was right in front of them. I mean, when they can do that, how do you confront that?
Yeah, I mean, people choose to ignore what they hear on the news, right? They say it's all made up.
Right.
Exactly.
So,
but didn't we all know somebody who was hospitalized with it, or at least significantly suffered, or was hospitalized, or even died? I mean, my aunt died of this virus. I mean,
I know
most people know someone who was seriously affected.
A lot of people.
So in your view, you cannot convince people to get vaccinated?
No, I think you can. I do. I mean, I get a lot of phone calls from people, and that's a biased sample because they're calling me, so presumably they may want information. But no, I think that most people sort of smell the smoke and want to know whether there's any fire there. Because remember, especially from the doctors, from your pediatrician, you do want your doctor to like you at some level. And I think when you say, I don't believe you, I'm not going to get these vaccines you're telling me to get, you just at some level distance yourself from this person who you want to like you when your child is ill. So I think people generally trust their doctors or nurses and just want information that is reassuring. So I do think people are reassurable. I mean, the people who call me, I would say 85% of the time, I can talk them off the ledge. But 15% of the time I can't.
Yeah, I think it's also important that, when you have those conversations, and I can imagine that you certainly would do this when you have those conversations, that you are actually talking to them as a human being, and not talking down to them and things like that. And I think that that's one issue that we have to also remember as we're trying to do this convincing, is how to do this convincing while still being humans and still having humanity for the person with whom we're speaking.
And people who are really scared of vaccines, they're not kidding. I mean, I've had my wife, who's in private practice pediatrics, will tell me there are people who when their children are being vaccinated, or just you finally convince them to get vaccinated, and they're crying because they're so scared of these vaccines. So we have really legitimately scared people about vaccines and what they can do.
Yeah. A lot of them that I've talked to say, I'm going to get my vaccine as soon as more studies come back to show that it really works. And I said, how many people do you need to participate in this experiment before you're totally convinced? Like, there are 7.5 billion people on the planet. And Paul, in your estimate, how many people of those people have been at least exposed to this virus? I would say half, more than half. And that's a big experiment. That's a very large experiment.
Yeah.
And you can clearly show what happens when you start the vaccination program in a place that wanted it and couldn't get it, and they could finally get it. The next thing you know, that, like you said, we can't see any evidence for the disease. Why are we being vaccinated? Excuse me?
Right.
In one of these chapters, Paul, you detail this the top 12 anti-vaccine activists, and it's really an amazing machine, right? It's the misinformation business. What is the motivation of these individuals? And they include RFK Jr., who is running for president on an anti-vaccine platform. What is their motivation?
Right. So there's a group called Center for Countering Digital Hate that put out a monograph that the New York Times picked up on and called it the disinformation dozen, meaning people or groups who constantly get that kind of misinformation out there. So what motivates them? I think they're an advocacy group that are supported by people who believe what they believe, which is that vaccines are doing harm, that are causing chronic diseases. And that's why we have these chronic diseases, because we're vaccinating our children. They really, I think most people who provide funds for that believe it. Does RFK Jr. believe it? I know he's met with Tony Fauci, and Dr. Fauci has explained to him why his notions that vaccines cause autism or other chronic disease are incorrect, but that wasn't good enough. So he is unconvincible. That's true. So why is that? Why is he unconvincible? I don't know, but it's
He had a
hard
rough childhood. He had a very rough childhood. It's not. I'm not kidding. I think.
Yeah, he did. You're absolutely right.
He's been damaged to the point, and remember, his family just held a family reunion, and he was not invited. So you can get a feeling for how much of an outlier of a candidate he really is, and he talks nonsense when he starts to get into the logic of why he doesn't believe in something. Up to that point, it's perfectly feasible that somebody with good intentions could end up believing that, but I don't think he has good intentions, to be honest with you.
Paul, do you think these people, this disinformation 12, do you think they have a real impact on vaccination rates? Did they have an impact on COVID?
Yes, no doubt about it. I mean, for the people who came into our hospital, so the vaccine was available in December 2020. And was available for those, at least the Pfizer vaccine, for anybody over 16, for Moderna, anybody over 18. By May, both these vaccines were available for anybody over 12. So when we would see adolescents in our hospital who were unvaccinated, and nonetheless were coming in because of significant respiratory disease and taken up to the intensive care unit or worse, they were willfully unvaccinated. They didn't want to be vaccinated. And, you would think that this moment when they were severely ill would have made them feel differently. But in many cases, it didn't. I remember there was in 2009, when the swine flu pandemic happened, There was a child who came in, it was young, 6, 7 years old, who was severely ill. And so, when it came up to the intensive care unit, was initially on face mask oxygen, then a ventilator, then an oscillator, then a heart-lung machine, lived but had, some brain damage from what were periods of low oxygen. And when it was all over, I remember talking to the mother, as gently as I could, what do you think about all this? I mean, if you were talking to someone who was thinking about getting an influenza vaccine, what would you say to them? And she said she thought she made the right decision, that had she gotten the vaccine, it would have been much worse. So it's interesting. Your job as a parent is to protect your child. To do something that puts your child, that you do, that specifically put your child in harm's way is a hard thing to live with. And I think that's one possible rationale.
But their idea that the vaccine is worse than infection is based on no scientific data whatsoever, right? So
in a world dominated by logic and reason, this wouldn't be a problem. But we sadly don't live in that world.
All right. Well, that's a great answer. Chapter 8 is about boosters. It's called Booster Confusion. Can you make it clear for us what we should be doing now?
Solve this issue once and for all today.
I heard about this guy who got 217 doses. Should I be doing that?
Yeah, he apparently has fairly broad protection. So go down.
Unfortunately, there's a spike growing out of the top of his head.
I think another communications error occurred a month after that July meeting, because in August 18th of 2021, President Biden got up in front of the American public and said that as of the week of September 20th, so 1 month hence, the government was going to offer a third dose of COVID vaccine. Now, this was still in the 2-dose period. Omicron hadn't come into the country yet, so 2 doses, at least up to that point, was still protecting against severe disease, which is the goal. So there was then an emergency meeting set up for the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee and the CDC Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices to then respond to this directive by the executive branch. There were 2 people, senior people at the FDA, who quit when that happened. Marion Gruber and Phil Krause. I made no doubt about. But no, they weren't mincing words about why they quit. They quit because of that. They quit because the administration had gone around the advisory bodies and just declared what we were going to do without making it so that the FDA could then allow that to happen, and the CDC would recommend it to happen. And so we considered that. And we had an emergency meeting on September the 17th, so 3 days before this was all going to start. And we said no, although we said that it was reasonable for a third dose for those over 65 because the Israeli data did to some extent support that. And the CDC said the same thing, but that confused people. Here you have the executive branch saying get a third dose, and then you have the FDA and CDC saying no. So what did it mean to be fully protected? And I think that confused people. In terms of the booster story, I think that the goal is to keep people out of the hospital and to keep them from dying. So who's getting hospitalized and who's dying? According to the CDC data, generally there are high-risk groups, people who are elderly, CDC, over 75. If you look at the UK data, over 80. People who have chronic medical conditions, which are generally people who are older, obviously, with heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, obesity, et cetera. People who are immune compromised, or people who are pregnant. So would it be reasonable to focus on those groups? Most countries do that. Most countries say we should boost every year those high-risk groups. We don't do that. We basically liken this vaccine now to the flu vaccine, saying give it to everybody over 6 months of age. Canada does the same thing, but not everybody else. European countries, Australia, Scandinavian countries, World Health Organization says do just high-risk groups. So I don't know. I mean, I think it makes sense to me to do it that way. I actually talked to Dr. Fauci about this at a National Foundation for Infectious Disease meeting and asked him that. I said, don't you think it makes sense to sort of target high-risk groups? He said, yes, but by targeting high-risk groups, by having a nuanced message, that becomes to some extent a garbled message, that you're much more likely to get those high-risk groups to get a vaccine if you recommend it for everybody. And he may well be right. I'm not sure. But then again, do you really want to give another dose to someone who's a healthy 16-year-old who's not necessarily going to benefit from that dose, or at least sort of low risk, low reward? I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I certainly know it's confusing for people to know what it means to be protected. And the same thing with what Dixon said earlier about long COVID. Do more doses lessen your risk of getting long COVID? And certainly there are data showing that the 3 doses definitely lessens your risk, but the fourth dose to some extent, but beyond that, there's really not evidence that you're lessening your risk.
I like that you mentioned the question about, or the point about whether or not a more complicated message garbles the message, because I think that to me is sort of a key question here is, how do we get the right message across if we know people aren't going to listen to the subtlety? And I think that is a really key question.
Well, do you think that, so presumably variants will continue to arise on a regular basis. Do you think we will have to adapt the booster every year, or are we going to get some data which say that isn't necessary?
Here's in a fantasy here's my fantasy. I would like to see excellent data from the CDC every year on who is getting hospitalized and who is dying from this virus. Exactly who are those people? Did they take an antiviral early in illness, even though they would have been recommended to do that? Who are those people? Because I think then we can target things the best. Also, I do think there's the good news and bad news about natural infection. I hate using the term natural infection because, it can kill you. So, and natural has a sort of a good sound. So survivor-induced immunity, maybe that. Dixon, so you've been infected a few times. The good news about being infected, I was infected in May of 2020, is that, now you have an immune response to all 4 viral proteins, including the nuclear protein, which seems to be the immunodominant recognition site for cytotoxic T cells, which clearly play a role in protecting against severe disease. I mean, I've had 3 doses of vaccine and 1 natural infection in May of 2022, so probably BA2. That was sort of circulating around that time, which, probably gives me fairly broad protection if you count cytotoxic T cells. I guess here's my fantasy vaccine, and I want to hear what you guys think. I would like to see a vaccine, which has been tested in experimental animals, but not people, that has mRNA representing the spike protein and mRNA representing the nuclear protein, because I think that cytotoxic T cells count. And when we just focus on antibodies all the time and don't really consider T cell. So, but Brianne, you know this better than me. What do you think?
You will never hear me. I'm Team T cell, very much so. I think that I would agree with you that I would love to see kind of some of the data in terms of what those vaccines look like in humans. And I think it would be tricky to do comparative studies right now because we see such great protection from disease, to see how we could change that protection from disease. But I agree with you, in a sort of perfect world, that would be a vaccine I would be very interested in.
Do you have any idea whether such a vaccine is in development at the moment?
There are studies, I think, in Syrian hamsters where they've looked at this at the breadth of protection, because the goal is protecting against severe disease. So memory matters. Memory B and T cells matter.
Absolutely.
I'd love to see, and this isn't easily done, but you'd love to see immunologists, academic immunologists weigh in on this and look at say somebody like me. I mean, I'm in my early 70s. I have gotten 3 doses of vaccine and natural infection. What are my level of memory B and T cells? I mean, and how about a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and then link that to the epidemiological studies to see really how often do we need to boost and who needs to get boosted, because this virus is going to be with us for decades, if not longer.
Absolutely.
I think we're fortunate right now that we actually have the ability to do that immunologically that we haven't been able to do for some other pandemics or some other large epidemics. But that would be really fabulous to have those data.
So, my take, Paul, with regards to the CDC's involvement in recommending, yes, you should start vaccinating because we're seeing an uptake in patients that have this particular antigenic signature. It's this virus. The flu vaccine falls into that category very nicely because it's seasonal. But I don't think this is not a seasonal thing. What do you think about that?
Well, so I'd be curious to see how SARS-CoV-2 plays out. I mean, will it settle into be one of the sort of winter respiratory viruses, part of the panoply of winter respiratory viruses? Because that's what you would expect, but that hasn't really clearly been true yet. I mean, it continues to circulate during the year. So how often to boost, when to boost is still going to be, we're going to be learning on the fly. One other thing that I said earlier in terms of things that we didn't know that we learn as we go, the one that actually bothered me a lot was the bivalent vaccine. I mean, the So it made sense, right? December 2021, Omicron comes into the United States. It is an immune evasive strain, at least for antibody recognition. And so why keep giving Wuhan 1, right? Why keep giving the ancestral strain? Why not at least include this in the vaccine? And so the thinking was, all right, we'll do a half a dose of Wuhan 1, half a dose of what ended up being BA4, BA5. The data that were presented to us at the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee were pretty unconvincing that immunologically this was going to be any better than what we had. Probably because of, imprinting that you just by putting, maybe because you put them in the same file, you were still recognizing the shared epitopes rather than the novel epitopes on BA4, BA5. But the data we presented was with BA1. And so there were some no votes. And then the clinical studies were done. And the immunological studies were done in larger numbers by Dan Bruick at Harvard, by David Ho at Columbia, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. There was no difference. And then the clinical studies, US, UK, France, showed no difference. That's okay. It's okay not to get it right the first time. What bugged me a little was that, you had public health officials saying, got to get this vaccine. It's much better. It contains, this Omicron variant that's circulating, and it wasn't better. And you did lose some scientists with that. I called people and said, it's boosters boost, this boosts, let's target high-risk groups, but please stop saying it's better when the data are continuing to show it's not better. We learned, right? So now we don't give half doses anymore of these, or link it anymore to the Wuhan 1 strain. And so the subsequent vaccines are better able to induce an immune response to those novel epitopes. It's okay to learn as you go. It's okay to say that. And I think we're scared to say that because we think we've already lost some trust and this will only lose more trust. But what do you guys think?
First of all, I agree very much so about the data on all of these things. That's one place where people have asked me a lot of questions, and I'm like, I think another dose is what you're getting there, and I'm not sure about the difference in some of the epitopes. So I would agree with you completely, and this gets back to the same problem of where I feel like I struggle with trying to get at all of these subtleties.
I think, Paul, there's a big difference in mild disease versus severe and young people versus old. So that challenge study that was done in the UK, we just did a paper on immune where they looked at immunological correlates, and they find in uncomplicated COVID, you need T cells really to prevent progression of infection. But it may not be good in older people. So as you and I discussed, you recommend Paxlovid. So I think you don't need the boost every year if you have a great antiviral that you can give very early on, right? But unfortunately, that's not available in a lot of countries.
No, that's such a great point. The 4 groups that I mentioned at high risk, one thing they all share in common is they may not make a very good immune response.
Yeah.
Right.
In which case, that's why the antiviral becomes something we should talk about more, and we don't. We seem to talk much more about boosters than we do about the antiviral.
Let's do a few more.
I had one more comment, if you don't mind, Vincent.
Go ahead.
My take on the whole thing is that it centers around the concept of trust. Trust is the basis for compliance. People will do something if they trust you, and they won't do something if they don't trust you. So the conspiracy theories that are out there right now, including the barge that just took down the Francis Scott Key Bridge, come on, give me a break. Those feed into people who want to mistrust because they've been burned in some way by the government. They didn't get their Social Security check on time, or they got not enough, or something else. Something about government just turns them the wrong way. And so they don't trust. So CDC is government. I don't trust. The FDA, that's government. I don't trust. So not trusting means that you don't believe. If you don't believe, well, science is not a belief system, for Christ's sakes. Don't you know that? No. It's a belief system. And it is a belief system that's founded on trust. So who do you trust? You trust the person that says, don't believe them, I'll help you. And when they say, at that point, and they say, trust me, at that point, your eyes should glass over, and you should wonder, now what do I do? Because you're caught in a quandary. You're caught in the crosshairs of 2 completely different cultures, and they're both aiming for your wallet. If you don't trust the government, you're not going to pay your taxes.
Yeah, a couple of things. let's go back to a second, sort of the DNA fragments. When the FDA was asked to respond to that, they said, we test vaccines very carefully, we look for safety issues very carefully, but they didn't explain it. We just explained it here. So when they don't explain it, what you're saying is, trust me,
you can't do that. Yeah.
I think you can try and explain this. I mean, I was on CNN with Brianna Keeler trying to answer this sort of DNA fragment thing. The other thing is just to get to the issue of how we can gain trust. I remember Richard Besser was the head of the CDC in 2009 during the swine flu pandemic, and he was great. He was out in front of the media every other day. Here's how we're making this vaccine. Here is how many tests we have. Here's who we need to vaccinate. Here's where we are. And I saw him at a recent meeting, and I said to him, you were great in 2009. Thank you. He said, thank you. I could never do it today. 2 reasons. Social meeting.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
All right. Paul, you have a whole chapter on long COVID, and a theme is, why is long COVID controversial? So talk a little bit about that, please.
Right. I think it became controversial early on in some ways because the most prominent symptoms, like fatigue or malaise or joint pain, weren't objective symptoms. They were subjective symptoms. Those were the most common. And so people wondered, whether this really was a real phenomenon or not, unfairly. Certainly long COVID exists, as does long flu, or arguably, or long Ebola virus, or long Epstein-Barr virus. There are a number of hepatitis B virus. There are viruses that can cause long-term symptoms. In fact, there was a recent study actually looking at sort of long COVID versus long flu, showing in many ways they're very similar. But I think we'll learn about it. In terms of trying to protect yourself against it, I think the data are pretty solid that 3 doses lessens your risk. It's less clear that 4 doses or beyond does much to lessen it, because that's one reason people keep getting vaccinated. There's 6. I have a friend who called me who's just gotten their 9th dose. I feel like, with the 10th dose, you get a free pizza, I'm pretty sure.
So chapter 12, should COVID vaccines have been mandated? What's the answer, Paul?
By the way, when you and I did that
Beyond the Noise, yeah.
with Beyond the Noise, that was, I think View Medi picked that up. So it was like tens of thousands of people saw that. So I got all this negative mail on both sides. People would say, I can't believe you in any sense questioned this. It was critical that we did this. And then on the other side, it's how can you mandate something that's unsafe? My favorite one, and I just got this one today, was I can't believe, that you in any way support mandates when vaccines can cause serious harm. Did you know, for example, that the Qatar Laboratories made a vaccine that paralyzed and killed children? Actually, I wrote a book about that, but, I wanted to write him back that, but I didn't, because he never want to get too involved with this. But certainly at the time, it made sense. Our hospitals were overwhelmed with this virus. We couldn't take care of other children. We eliminated elective surgeries. It was so galling to watch people not be vaccinated and yet come into the hospital and use hospital resources. It just seemed so patently unfair that mandating vaccines made sense. In a better world, you shouldn't have to mandate vaccines. I would argue I was well informed about these vaccines. I read the 300 pages associated with Moderna's vaccine, the 300 pages associated with Pfizer's vaccine when we had to consider these vaccines for our, for whether we would authorize them on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. I couldn't wait to be vaccinated. I think I was fully informed about these vaccines. But, if people choose not to get it and then put themselves and others at risk and we're overwhelming the healthcare system, was that fair? And so I think it was a reasonable thing to do. The problem is these mandates were broad. You couldn't go to the restaurant you want to go to, couldn't go to a sporting event, you couldn't go to a place of worship, you couldn't go to a bar you wanted to go to, you would be fired from work. There was someone in our division who was fired from her job because she refused to be vaccinated. And so that leaned right into the libertarian left hook that was, I don't want government overreach. And that's why I think in many ways it was, you're now seeing hundreds of bills pushing back against not just COVID vaccines, but against all vaccines, or against masking mandates. I think in some ways we're less prepared for our next pandemic because we did that. But I don't, getting a vaccine lessened your risk of transmission, lessened your risk of getting disease. I think it's certainly made sense to do that, but I can see the backlash that's come because of it. So, but I do think we should have mandated them, yes.
Do you think there's a correlation between the anti-vaxxer movement and homeschooling as a result of mandated vaccines in the old days. Because I remember when I first started working at Columbia, no vaccine, no school. You have to get vaccinated. And there were a lot of immigrants, of course, that bought into that because they didn't even have an option where they came from. But that's the reason why it was around where I worked. But I think that you've got the rise of these private school systems and homeschooling as a way of avoiding mandated laws that they don't trust.
Right.
Yes.
It's hard to homeschool, but you're right. That's a pop-off valve. The one thing I disagreed with on mandates, and there was a meeting actually with Rochelle Walensky and Tony Fauci and Vivek Murthy and Francis Collins actually in February of 2022 about whether natural infection should count as vaccination, and I was of the opinion it should. I mean, I think that you were likely to be protected after natural infection. It made sense that you would be, and there were certainly data that you could be, and we didn't do that. I wish we had have allowed it because people were fired from their jobs even though they had been naturally infected, and that I don't think was fair. What do you guys think? If you were part of that meeting where there were 4 people who were voting, there were I'm not going to tell you who they were, but the funny part of that was it started off, so it's like Francis Collins, right? Francis Collins, so let's go around the room. Vivek Murthy, who could not be a nicer guy. Let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. There were sort of 4 quote unquote experts and then them. And so Francis Collins goes, my name is Francis Collins. I'm the head of the National Institutes of Health. And Tony Fauci said, I'm Tony Fauci. I'm the head of NID. I said, we know who you are.
I would have counted infection as a vaccination for sure. Of course. I mean, it's better in some sense because you get more protein. It's not better because there's a big risk, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I would have counted it immunologically, and I would have asked the question of, my only question is, how do I know you're infected? Do you get a card?
Exactly right.
Bureaucratic issue. I mean, because that wouldn't hardly download the PCR positivity on the internet, right?
Right. That would be my only question is, I guess this goes back to trust. Do I trust you that you said when you tell me you've been vaccinated?
That's right.
I have 2 more questions. One is, if this were to happen again and we've had this experience, and let's say in 5 years we get a similar big different virus, really community spread, extensive, how should we do things differently than what we did, starting from the beginning?
I think early on we need to explain exactly how these vaccines are made and how they work as best we can. I think we should have a reasonable expectation, what you can reasonably expect from this vaccine. And I think we should also make very dramatic the stories of people who are hurt. We tend not to do that because of HIPAA regulations or whatever, privacy concerns. I think we could have even been more dramatic about how focusing on an individual. I mean, from what I felt like early on when I would take care of kids who would initially come onto the floor with severe respiratory disease, then you're taking them up to the intensive care unit because now you're going to need to potentially ventilate them, which we did probably more than we need to early on, but ventilate them, and the parents are crying, and the siblings are crying. In many ways, I wish there were videos of that so people could see this is what this disease looks like, and it's preventable. Here's the data on what your likelihood is of getting this disease if you're vaccinated versus you're not vaccinated. I mean, you saw what happened. There was, for whatever reason, I think it was this whole libertarian notion that, you were much more likely to be hospitalized and die if you lived in a heavily red county than a heavily blue county, roughly 60-fold difference in that first year of being hospitalized and dying. Yeah. It was called red COVID at one point.
There's a lot of foxhole Christian behavior when someone who was an anti-vaxxer gets a serious COVID infection, goes to the hospital, and he's near or she is near death. There have been many testimonials that said, I wish I had taken the vaccine. And they actually said that to their doctor the moment they breathed their last breath. And how do you, is there a HIPAA regulation that you're not allowed to show that?
No, I think I talk about a woman named Brittany Cobia, who was an intensivist in Alabama, who talked about her experiences dealing with patients who were dying, and many of them said exactly what you said, which is, We wish we got it. But the question she asked that she always got a no answer to was, did you talk to anybody about this? Did you talk to
exactly.
this? Actually, interesting, very early on, I don't know if you remember this, the CDC, when we were overwhelmed at the hospital level, the CDC said, don't go to the emergency room. Don't go to the hospital if you're sick.
Right.
Call your doctor. Well, so that assumes everybody has a doctor. And that's not true. And, and I think same thing now with sick leave, for example. Stay home for 5 days. Stay home for 10 days. Not everybody can stay home that long. And I think those are problems with the infrastructure that we can do.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you didn't say this, but if this were to happen again, one of the things we need right away is a rapid, cheap test, an antigen test, so everyone could take one every day and know whether they're positive and stay home instead of shutting everything down. That might be, and Michael Minner came on early on and talked about that, but it didn't happen until many a year later or more, right?
Well, we put it all in the CDC. So the CDC was developing that test. We should have farmed that out to, many different companies to do it. And then they had a problem with their negative control, so they had to recall it. And so you looked at these other countries like South Korea, which were way ahead of us in making these tests available.
Yep. All right. So my last question is, one of the impressions I get, big ones, is that there's been a recent shift where all of this vaccinology and science about infectious diseases has become politicized, as we've already mentioned. So is that irreversible, or is there something? I mean, politicians are running on a platform of being anti-vax, knowing they will get votes for it, which just seems horrible to me. How can we fix that?
In the end, it's only the voter who can really hold them accountable if they're putting out bad information. And that I'm not sure how well that's going to work, but that's who they are beholden to. That's who they are appealing to. And so you could argue the best way then would be to educate that voter about how this is bad information and it's putting themselves or their families at risk. But it's the voter ultimately who makes that decision.
So it's all about communication and education.
Right. And that's where you guys come in.
Yeah, but we need help.
We're talking to ourselves.
Brianne, Dixon, any other questions?
Millions of dollars that these other companies are doing to be better off.
My only other question is about sort of Paxlovid. What are your thoughts about kind of Paxlovid availability both in the U.S. and outside the U.S. and how it plays into this?
I think we can do a better job with Paxlovid. I think two things end up happening that has caused there to be a lesser use of Paxlovid than there should be. One is the doctor who says, let's just wait for a few days and see whether this really does get bad. That's Number two is it does have a number of drug-drug interactions. And certainly older people who have high-risk medical conditions are often on a variety of drugs. And in some ways, it's easier for the doctor just to say, there's so many drug-drug interactions here. I don't want to try and adjust all this, either to go to drugs which are similar but don't have the same kind of interaction, or stop those drugs for a few days because you're at high risk of it's always a matter of risk-benefit, that this would be, getting COVID would be the greater risk, or not treating COVID would be the greater risk. And so I think we're not great at it. I forget the most recent statistics from the CDC, but a significant percentage of people who were hospitalized and died should have gotten Paxlovid and didn't. So you're right. It's an underused lifesaver.
Also, and as I mentioned before, many countries outside of the U.S. simply can't get it.
Right.
And
right.
That shouldn't be. It should be available to everyone, right?
It's true. One of the big lessons that they always teach on your way up the academic ladder of public health is the eradication of the one disease in the world that everyone was fearful of and is no longer fearful of it. And that story hasn't been well told in recent years. And smallpox, although it could never come back, supposedly, is the best example I know of, and I'm sure that you would agree, that you target every effort towards that one entity, and you have a mass world buy-in, and the next thing you know, you have no more of that. So if you can fill in that blank, if instead of smallpox, you can make measles that way, or you can make COVID-19 that way too.
Yeah, the long incubation period diseases can be eliminated. Smallpox, polio, measles, rubella. You can eliminate those diseases. We'll never eliminate the short.
Okay.
Right.
Paul Offit, University of Pennsylvania, Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. Thank you, Paul, for joining us today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. This was
great.
Really informative.
Nobody like him. I would listen to him all day long.
It's wonderful to listen to. Yeah.
He's a fantastic raconteur.
Let's read a couple of emails and do our picks.
All
How's
right.
that for a plan?
Sounds good.
Dixon, can you take the first one?
I will gladly do so. Clarissa writes, I'm listening to TWiV 1095, and I think the virus name needs clarification. It's still referred to as monkeypox virus. The ICTV pox virus group opted to keep it as it is. However, WHO changed the disease name to mpox, mainly because of discrimination issues. WHO cannot decide virus names, only disease names. So it's still monkeypox virus that causes mpox. I'm attaching some references below if the TWiV team wants to read more about it. The most important is the one by David Ulaeto and the WHO technical lead for mpox outbreak, Rosamund Lewis. By the way, great episode.
So Clarissa is in Brazil. She is a pox virus researcher who knows Rich Conda very well, obviously. Clarissa Damaso.
I'm confused, though, as to why the word monkeypox is somehow discriminatory.
Well, you should read the document.
I think. Yeah.
By the way, ICTV is the International Committee for the Taxonomy of Viruses. So they name the viruses. And WHO names the disease. That's why we have SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, right?
Yes, and whenever I teach virology and I talk about ICTV, I have to tell my students that when they Google it, they have to make sure they get the virology one, not the Russian TV station one. Yeah.
Brianne, can you take the next one?
Sure. Bob writes, Hi, Twivers. Another couple of great episodes, TWiVs 1090 and 1091. Just to note from 1091 that the last name of Dire Straits' OBE guitarist is pronounced Knopfler, silent K, silent P. Further to the OBE, I can't remember the precise recent TWiV episode, but I was yelling at my computer speaker when your team did not recall one famous OBE microbiologist you even had on the show within the past couple of years, Dame Sarah Gilbert, technically DBE, Dame of the British Empire. I do see on Wikipedia she plays sax, so skeptics might challenge the source of her regal fame. Was it for her music or scientist fame? Further wiki details about her having to practice sax in the woods so as not to disturb her fellows had me pretty certain the Dame name is more attributable to the production and distribution of a couple billion vaccine doses, which she oversaw. Back to work. Thanks as always for the great work you do. Bob.
Yeah. We forgot about that. Chadox, right? The Chadox vector. Nice. Steve writes, as a long-term listener and postal carrier, I want to thank the team for the support on episode 1091. I listened faithfully while delivering on my route of 660 homes. We've been underfunded and in need of an overhaul for many years. In fact, the vehicle I currently drive is over 33 years old and 10 plus years past its expected usage lifetime. Keep up the good work and please keep those episodes coming. Science rules. P.S. Let Vincent know we received no discount for stamp prices. So he's going to have to pay like the rest of us. I think it's so great. We're talking about postal carriers delivering mail and listening to TWiV. And here you go. Steve is great. I love it. The next time I see my postal carrier, I'll say, I wonder if he or she is listening to TWiV. Dixon, I hate to give you a long one. So let me give this. Can I give it to Brianne and then you could take the next short one?
Whatever you like.
Yeah, I don't want you to get too tired. Brianne, can you take John's?
Sure. John writes, Vincent, RE your star and sphere kit in 1083. I don't know whether this ever crossed your window, but at least in the case of the lambdoid phage HK97, assembly of which that Roger Hendricks et al. Worked on for so many years, at least one capsid protein mutant is capable of blocking pentamer formation, yet still assembles. That could be reflected using the kit by filling in all the hexamers with, say, paper. You would then have a capsid with open pentamers resembling a wiffle ball, and that is exactly what the Hendricks lab called the structure.
Cool.
There was also a asterisk at one point about the Hendrix lab working on this, and we have a link. And as related to that asterisk, it also says, if you go to reference 26 in this paper, you'll find the publication reflecting my tiny contribution to the whole effort. Confirmation of the cross-subunit crosslink between a LYS and AZN sidechain pair. But this raises a question. Do you know of any other viruses that have a naturally covalently cross-linked capsid monomers? I suspect that there are others, but that few viruses are studied with scrutiny sufficient to detect cross-linked capsid monomers. Whenever I try to search for something like that, all I get is phage capsids with induced chemical crosslinks. 1090. In comments about Alabama, it should be noted that there is intelligent life there. Please note, I just said that based on reading. I'm not saying that there was an intelligent life. Nobody quoted this for me. That noted that there is intelligent life there in Huntsville. Besides the Space Center, there is also the Hudson Alpha Institute, which, in just a couple words, is a genomics institute. It was founded by two entrepreneurs who made it big and wanted to give something back. You cannot imagine all the projects that they support. The campus is awe-inspiring too, and they run workshops in the summer to bring secondary science teachers up to speed with modern biology. If you ever find an excuse to have a podcast from there, I would put in a vote for it. 1091. Obelisks. I expected that you would take them up, and thanks for that. I was counting on a better understanding via TWiV. I didn't hear it mentioned, but someone must have proposed that these things may represent primitive units of evolution. With the self-complementarity presumed helping to protect them, then them with something like that melts them and an agent of transcription they could replicate. That primitive agent would presumably be sloppy, so mutations would be rampant, introducing variability, which once in a lottery cycle might produce something with better function once translated, and whenever that got assimilated into some microorganism, that bug could become more fit. Once inside the bug, too, it would no longer need the self-complementarity for protection and be free to gradually shed that aspect, with the redundancy of the code aiding in the shedding while retaining any beneficial pieces of the encoded protein. Otherwise, don't be surprised if you see my name on an abstract at Viruses at Microbes describing the use of phage for clinical diagnostics. I won't be there, only on my trip to the Antipodes, 1994, to New Zealand, which was great. I came back with what I strongly suspect was a coronavirus, courtesy of the Swedish contingent that picked it up in Bangkok, that nearly gave me pneumonia and took several months to return to normalcy from. I can't take that chance again, but you will likely run into my colleague Rob Edgar there. I also saw that my old department's former grad student Heather Hendrickson, now from New Zealand, is one of the organizers. If you don't know her, she's a big fan of TWiV and is also a science communicator who has made TV appearances in that role down there. From a dismal but temperate 18C morning in Greater Braddock, where the gray sky almost has a yellow tinge. Thunder and lightning yesterday and this morning, and headed for schizophrenia late with wind and sharply dropping temps, just like what's headed your way. John.
What a great ending. What a great ending.
Yow.
I will look up Heather in Viruses of Microbes for sure. And I don't know of other cross-linked capsids. The HK97 we used to have in the textbook for a while, it's no longer there. It was likened to chainmail. One of the few that we know of that's cross-links because they're supposed to be reversible bonds, right?
Yes.
All right, Dixon, can you take Darak?
I can. Darak writes, folks, in episode 1087, I believe the topic of creatine was broached. This is a fascinating little molecule and one of the very few supplements that do anything at all. Except steroids, of course, because, to paraphrase Eric Trexler, we can fix anything with steroids. Creatine's major role is thought to be not in any sort of proteinogenic capacity, but rather as an intracellular buffer/carrier for phosphate groups. Creatine kinase loads up this phosphocreatine system such that it's ready to recharge ADP to ATP when there's sudden demands on cellular energy system. This is especially true in skeletal muscle, where phosphocreatine outnumbers ATP several times over. Here's a review of the ATP phosphocreatine anaerobic glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation energy systems contribution to a sustained skeletal muscle performance. Your body synthesizes creatine. Omnivores also get a lot of creatine from meat consumption. This may explain that vegetarians often respond better to creatine supplementation. It doesn't make you stronger, but it does help you sustain a little bit more effort in a sprint, a series of jumps, or that 5th rep. No, creatine is not bad for your kidneys. You can buy creatine monohydrate online. And friends, bulk supplements, It's a sort of chalky powder, but it goes down easy in water. Works for me, probably. Good times. Be strong. Keep moving. Track.
It doesn't harm your kidneys, but when they do blood chemistry, they look at creatine levels, and if they're high,
do.
that means you have kidney problems, right?
They also look at creatinine, which is a totally different molecule.
Oh, maybe that's what I'm thinking
It's
of.
creatinine.
I
It's
think
not
so.
creatine. It's creatinine.
It's not creatine. Yes.
No, it's creatinine. That's
Brianne,
right.
do you use creatine?
I do not use creatine.
So you do all those deadlifts and you don't take
Yeah,
any creatine?
the chalky powder thing's a real problem for me.
Creatine. It doesn't make you stronger. You know, Angela Mingarelli swears by it.
Really?
I mean, she's a big exercise person. She does weightlifting and stuff. She swears by it. She said, if you want big muscles, you need to take creatine.
Well, but if it's as he said, if it helps you sustain a little bit more effort, then maybe that change in effort helps.
Remember, you're killing muscle cells when you exercise, so you have to replace them, and maybe this helps in the replacement process.
Why are you killing muscle cells?
That's called getting cut and ripped. In order to get bigger muscles, you have to destroy the muscles that's there. Then there's an overproduction to make up for the deficit, and that's how you get bigger.
Well,
unless you use steroids.
Steroids will fix anything.
Hopefully,
Brianne will, not Brianne, Angela will address this on their new exercise podcast.
There you go. There you go.
All right, we have one more from Peter, who's Peter Sarno, the author of a paper we did on circular RNAs recently. Dear Vincent, it was awesome to listen to your podcast last week. The first response from my coworkers was, he perfectly pronounced our names. Wow. We were absolutely delighted that our circRNA study got your attention. Cytoplasmic splicing, circRNA generation, we looked high and low whether the unfolded protein response is involved. But no, the IRE nuclease is not. We are looking at a cytoplasmic version of drosha that is known to cleave pre-miRNA-like structures in mRNAs. Ligases, there are tons of RNA ligases, tRNA ligases in the cytoplasm. We are checking them out. I love the name drosha, right? Drosha, you can do your little R trill. Drosha. Privit. You know, I'm practicing these Russian words. No, I don't know. I'm not going to Russia. Privit. Someone on the live stream is in Russia, and she says, Vincent, it's privit. Okay. Sorry. Drosha. More, and you know, Dixon, reduvido.
Reduvido is Italiano. It's Italiano.
Yeah,
Reduvido
this is
Italiano.
you showing off your Italian skills.
And I are trolling. More recently, we found a super abundant 130 nucleotide viral circRNA in enterovirus 71. It spans the VP12A sequences, where there is a hotspot for intratypic recombination. Maybe it regulates that recombination in some way, huh?
Yeah.
We're also lucky that Kunin wrote a commentary. Of course, my work will never reach the New York Times like yours, but you made my week. All the best, Peter Sarno. How do you know it won't reach the New York Times? You're not finished. You don't know. I was very lucky, yes.
That's right.
But you don't know. Don't say it will never. Never say never. Isn't that the saying, Dixon and
You
Brianne?
betcha.
It is.
You betcha.
Never say never.
Yep.
All right, time for some picks of the week. Dixon, what do you have for us?
I have an astronomy pick, which seems to be popular among the podcasters on this show. And this one is a remarkable picture. It's an actual, I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was an artist's rendering, as they often say underneath in small print, so that you, ah, darn. No, this is not an artist rendering. This is an actual image that the Event Horizon Telescope has put together of the black hole at the center of our Milky Way. And they were the first ones to show the black hole without this technology that I'm about to talk about, back in 2022, as I recall. So it's a consortium of 8 radio telescopes spread throughout the world so that they can triangulate the entire planet's worth of radio telescopes. And these 8 cover the entire curvature of the Earth, so they can focus all 8 on an object in space and record from it the images that they give off in terms of heat and, in this case, magnetism. So what you're looking at now is a return to the black hole in the center of our Milky Way, which is billions of times larger than our sun. And they used a polarizing filter. And in doing so, they were able to visualize the magnetic fields that a black hole creates by its spin up. So it's spinning like crazy, and it's sucking in matter all over the place. And what you're looking here, this picture, it's a single picture, is the magnetic fields generated by this, well, I would call it a very large electric motor. And it's quite remarkable. Quite remarkable. And so people think of black holes as destructive agents of our universe, but another recent picture taken this time by the Hubble Space Telescope, and I'll use that for my next pick next time whenever I come back on this show, is an exact straight line of new stars, which stretches out over hundreds of light years. And what they're predicting is that this exact straight line of new stars was generated by a rogue black hole.
A rogue black hole.
Rogue black hole.
What is a rogue black hole?
A rogue black hole is a black hole that is not in the center of a galaxy.
Ah.
So it's a star that turned into one of these through using up all of its hydrogen.
I see.
And it becomes a wanderer throughout the universe. But when it sucks up matter, it doesn't exactly keep it. It spews it out the other side.
Really?
Yes. And so these jets that you're seeing that come out from, let's say, the Crab Nebula, if you go to the picture of the Crab Nebula taken by the James Webb Space Telescope, you can actually see the neutron star that was created by that massive star ejection. And there are jets that come out of either side of this neutron star. Well, the same thing happens with a black hole. So that means that the matter isn't destroyed, because if you can't destroy matter, right? You can just convert it to energy. And the energy, if it exits the black hole, returns to, and that mass is, I'll show you the picture next week. It's quite fascinating. I don't know any other picture I've ever seen in outer space that shows as though someone took a pen and a ruler and drew a line and then put little dots along that line. But that's exactly how this looks.
Dixon, so at some point in the future, our sun will become a black hole? Is that the idea?
Well, our sun will certainly go supernova on us. There's no question about that.
I mean, it's a star, right?
It's a star, but there's no. It's a dwarf star. It's not a large star. It's a dwarf.
So not every star becomes a black hole.
That's correct. They can become neutron stars rather, and neutron stars are very common in our universe, and in fact, most 50% of all the stars in the universe are pairs of stars. They're binary systems. So when those stars become neutron stars, they rotate around each other, and their gravity is so intense that eventually they collide. And when they do, they release gravity waves, which we can then detect. I've become quite interested in all of this because eventually, as you well know, all matter, no matter where it is, will be recycled into more matter. You go into matter and then energy and then matter and then energy
Yeah.
and then Lord knows
Well,
what I'll come back as. But
speaking of gravity waves, Chiara Mingarelli, who was on TWiV a while ago, she studies gravity waves.
and they're generated by collisions between circulating neutron
how it
stars.
all comes together. Fascinating stuff.
It's fascinating.
So the rogue black holes move around.
They do.
Why? Why do they move around?
Well, they're not being particularly well. They have momentum going for them. So they were ejected from their galaxy by some catastrophic event.
Probably a chairman of the department.
Yeah,
That sounds
exactly
likely.
right. Exactly right. It was a committee letter that they received in the mail that said, "You're fired.
You're ejected."
Yeah.
You ain't seen fire until you've seen my fire, big guy." At any rate, there are lots of wandering black holes out there, apparently.
So why does the solar system stay in one place? Doesn't have any momentum.
Well, it does have momentum. Our solar system has a big momentum that was
Is it
created
moving?
by its formation.
Is it moving?
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
I know I'm asking the wrong people these questions.
It is. It's
I'm just
moving.
curious about this.
Well, we're in the Milky Way galaxy, and the Milky Way galaxy rotates.
Right.
Yeah.
But we are
Very slowly,
also moving through our galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
So gravity, even though the term gravity sucks, in this case, if you're a neutron star or the one I've heard about recently, which is the most frightening thing I've ever heard, is a magnetar. And this is a star which degenerates into a super magnet.
Okay.
And the description of this object is so frightening that it makes black holes look like participants in a religious revival.
Makes Ebola virus look like rhinovirus.
Like some friendly. That's right.
So let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
So you said the solar system is moving through the Milky Way
It is
very slowly.
very slowly, but still moving.
Is it going to collide into something, or it's not
It's
a problem? It's
possible.
we don't worry about it because it's a long time in the future.
Yeah,
right?
it's a long time in the future.
All right. Fascinating stuff. And Brienne, do you like astronomy?
I
too?
do really like
She does,
astronomy.
she
I
does,
do
she
really
does,
like
yeah.
astronomy.
You
yes.
must have astronomy professors at Drew, right?
We do, and we have a big telescope on the top of this building.
Right.
And you could go to their seminars. That would be
I
cool,
could.
right?
But I find astronomy really exciting and interesting.
It's great.
Oh, cool.
It's great.
Thank you, Dixon.
You're welcome.
The test of a pick is whether it generates discussion, I think,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I would agree. You got to look
Yeah,
at this
Brienne.
picture, though. It's really quite interesting.
It is a cool picture. Brienne, what do you have for us?
So I have a story that I actually learned about in one article, but that article was paywalled, so I found everyone another one. About something called the Herculaneum scrolls, which I didn't know about, and then the way that they are currently being read. So the first thing I learned about were these scrolls that were from an ancient town in ancient Roman town that had a giant library in antiquity with 1,800 scrolls and of papyrus that were preserved when Pompeii exploded.
Right.
Or when Mount Vesuvius exploded. And as a result, we have all of these scrolls, and they're actually some of a very small number of papyrus scrolls that we have that have been preserved, so we could actually, read them instead of relying on translations or whatever. But these 1,800 scrolls were baked to charcoal when Mount Vesuvius erupted. And so while we have them, we actually can't unroll them, because if we unrolled them, they would turn to dust.
Right.
Wow.
And so there's been sort of this question for all of this time of, what could we learn if we could ever figure out how to read them? And if we knew what they said, who knows what kind of cool stuff we could learn. And a group of AI researchers have actually figured out a way to use AI to start to read them. So they've first taken these scrolls and done CT scans, and then used machine learning to try to make to learn about what the writing actually says. They set up a contest for machine learning and AI researchers to come up with algorithms to do this. And the winning person was an undergraduate student from the University of Nebraska. The second place person was a PhD student from Egypt, and they actually were able to read part of one of the scrolls and find out that it was talking about how sort of the philosophy of how we deal with food scarcity. But it proves that it's possible. And so now they're going to be able to look at this entire ancient library of 1,800 scrolls and do CT scans and use AI and machine learning to be able to read them. And who knows what we'll learn. So I thought that was just a super cool story.
Oh, that is great.
So these are all rolled up. So the AI has to first kind of unroll it.
Yeah, so they have to do some kind of AI unrolling, and then they can, I guess they've figured out a way to actually determine what pigment is the writing pigment.
Yeah. And then it says here that they got about 5% of what's there. So I presume they could eventually get the rest.
Yeah,
right?
so I think the idea was that 5% was a proof of concept.
I see.
That they could do it. And now that they were able to get that 5%, they're moving forward with the rest of the library.
Goodness.
So that it talks about music and color and other kinds of pleasure like that, right?
In the 5% that they've seen, and they who knows what they'll see in the rest.
The basic topics include: how do we live a good life? How do we avoid pain? Well, good. I hope they have answers.
Right. Who knows what we'll learn?
That's very cool. Yeah, they have an aim of reading 85% of a scroll by the end of the year. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I thought, I didn't know anything about this. First of all, I thought that the fact that I guess this library was underground and the heat of the explosion didn't burn the papyrus, but just changed its form of matter so it persisted. I thought that was cool. And then the fact that we could actually figure out a way to use machine learning to read it was super cool too.
Right.
And they said people didn't think it could be done. So what did we say before? Never say never.
Exactly.
Never, ever say that
Very
word.
cool.
That's right.
Thank you, Brianne.
Yeah.
That's great.
My pick is very simple. It's a thing on Instagram. An account on Instagram. Thank you. Called biotech.symposium. I like Instagram, and I often look at it. And this one is this morning. It has little videos, and this one was called "Bending Over in Your Lab Coat." And this lady, she drops her pen, and then she bends over, and all this stuff falls out. And then she just picks up the pen and walks away. I think it was so funny. And so I went and looked, and there's all kinds of cool stuff here about lab. Like there's one about negative data, and there's one on me and my friend using a whole box of tips in one 3-hour lab. Real life footage of cell division, some interesting animations. And then there's this one PhD student with a sign on her back. Please do not ask me when you're going to graduate. What's your plans for after? How are you? How's your thesis going? Has your paper been published yet? I think it's really funny.
Excellent.
And, it's got some teaching. So I'm interested in how people communicate. And this is an interesting one. Lab personality is based on pipette tip boxes.
I've seen that before. And I also have realized that I have a very strong lab personality pipette tip box.
That's very cool.
Pipette tip box personality or whatever.
And you have walls of plaque assays.
Well, I used to. They're gone.
They're gone.
My office was cleaned out. But, they have 328,000 followers. That's pretty good. And I always wonder what gets more followers. I mean, I have a personal Instagram account. It's got 7,000 followers. I thought that was good, but the 328,000. We have a Microbe TV account that has less than me. So I want to know how to do it. So that's why I look at these things. But it's fun. Check it out.
Nice.
All right, that will do it for TWiV 1101. So this is an interesting number that we have now. 1101. I think that's the way to say it, right? 1101.
Yes.
1101, 1102, 1122, etc. You can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiV. If you want to send questions or comments or a pick of the week to us, we'd love to get them. We really would. TWiV@microbe.tv. If you want to visit the incubator, you could do that too. You could send an email to incubator@microbe.tv. All right, let me add this to the show notes. This is something new. Incubator@microbe.tv. If you want to visit, you can just email, and our staff here, we have a lovely staff now, will arrange a visit for you, and I'll be here, and we could hang out for a little while and show you this cool place. So that's incubator@microbe.tv. And if you enjoy our work, support us. Microbe.tv/contribute. Dixon Des Pommiers at trichinella.org and thelivingriver.org. Thank you, Dixon.
A most enjoyable show, Vincent. Thank you for including me.
Is it, well, you have an open invitation. You know that everybody does.
Yes, I agree, but this was particularly enjoyable, and I'm glad
Is it still light out there, Dixon? I can't tell.
Oh,
It's light
absolutely.
out.
No, it's going to be light for quite a while.
Brianne Barker's at Drew University. Bio Prof. Barker on Blue Sky. Thank you, Brianne.
Thanks. I learned a lot.
You say blue sky, not blue ski, right?
I believe you say blue sky. The icon is like a blue sky, so.
Bluski would be a Russian word.
Yes,
Bluski. Ivan Bluski. I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. I'd like to thank the American Society for Virology and the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV, Ronald Jenkins for the music, and Jolene for the timestamps. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.